The following program is funded in part by grants from the United States Environmental Protection Agency and Nebraskans for Public Television. This program is a production of the University of Nebraska-Lincoln Television, which is solely responsible for its content.
Late winter is a quiet time in the farm country of south-central Nebraska. Life is still dormant in the rock-cold soil. Although winter has not yet released its grip on the land, the voices of spring can be heard in the bitter north wind. Even before there is open water, the first of 5 to 7 million ducks and geese begin to arrive in this region, known as Nebraska's Rainwater Basin. Just as they have for countless generations, these water birds are migrating northward from wintering grounds on the Gulf Coast, Mexico, and Central America. Driven by tradition and a powerful biological urge to reproduce, these birds are chasing spring north, thousands of miles to their nesting grounds in the northern prairies and Arctic tundra. But it is here, in the marshes of the Rainwater Basin, where their success or failure on the nesting grounds will be determined. Here they will rest and feed, preparing for the difficult journey that lies ahead. For these birds, a successful season will depend on many conditions beyond their control.
From the beginning, there were a large number of marshes here before white man arrived on the scene, over 4,000. Then as time progressed, the marshes were drained and filled and converted to other uses, and migratory birds in particular crowded into the few remaining wetlands left, and that's created all kinds of problems.
Waterfowl are in as bad a shape as they've been since they've been keeping records. Mallard populations, pintail populations, and some of the teal populations are the lowest that they've ever been. And this has been basically because of habitat loss.
You know, we bemoan the destruction of tropical rainforests, and rightly so, but these wetlands are probably acre for acre producing almost as much oxygen as the rainforest.
Economics is right in the middle of it. Short-term gains over the past several decades have dictated that those marshes be drained and converted to cropland. Drainage paid. That's the reason those wetlands were converted, and not necessarily by people that hated ducks. It was a matter of economic survival, and they did what they had to do.
You know, it's not a case where, hey, we've got a problem, let's spend taxpayers' money to solve it. It's a case, we've got a problem, let's quit spending taxpayers' money to help create the problem.
It's not the landowner that gains the big values of these wetlands out here. In fact, it's not the state of Nebraska. The importance of these wetlands are international.
Before Europeans arrived, central Nebraska south of the Platte River was the heart of America's vast buffalo range. A nearly flat plain covered with grass and dotted with natural wetlands. Because rain-filled marshes were so abundant, early settlers named this region the Rainwater Basin.
And I suspect that when the white settler first hit this part of the country and wetlands were every place, waterfowl were abundant, and they were trying to scratch out a living, and these wetlands stood in the way of cultivating areas, and so the real goal was to drain the water off of them and put them into agricultural production.
No one can say with certainty how many wetlands there were in south-central Nebraska at the time of settlement, But soil surveys from the early 1900s suggest the Rainwater Basin area once contained nearly 4,000 marshes covering nearly 150 square miles. As early as 1900, marshes were already being drained to increase farmland. Following World War II, large earth-moving equipment was available and gravity flow irrigation became more common. With the introduction of center pivot irrigation during the 1960s, south central Nebraska became one of the most intensively irrigated regions in the world.
You have to remember that we, and by we I mean the government as a whole, for the last 50 years have been telling that guy, we need to improve this land, we need to drain. We've paid for part of the drainage even. I'm talking about some of the ag programs that have gone back 50 or 60 years.
During the last century, 90% of the wetlands have been filled or drained, principally to make way for increased crop production. The decline of water birds and other wildlife, like the loss of wetlands, was gradual and nearly imperceptible. But over the last century, the loss has been staggering.
When I was a kid, there was basins everywhere. They've really disappeared.
Lee Morris has lived in the Rainwater Basin area for more than 60 years. During that time, he has seen many changes come to the region's wetlands and way of farming.
When I was a child, there was farmsteads every quarter of a mile, or at least every half. Now I was lucky if there's one on a mile. It's ridiculous when you have to farm a half a county to make a living. That isn't right. That causes this too, more or less. Push them to make a living, they destroy everything to farm more. I'm interested in saving all the wildlife we can. That's why I put this farm in the conservation program to save the wildlife. I don't know what these birds will all do if they continue to drain them. The government is finally trying to stop it somewhat, but so far they haven't been too successful, really. They're still draining them.
Today, only 10% of the original rainwater basins remain. Of those, over half are owned and protected by the United States Fish and Wildlife Service or by the Nebraska Game and Parks Commission. Some wetlands hold water for only a few weeks in the spring. Some cover no more than a few acres. Others are larger, deeper, and filled with water year-round. Together, they form a wetland complex which meets many wildlife needs.
The big value that these things have is each one provides different types of food, loafing sites for waterfowl than the others. Part of the reason why Nebraska in general and the Rainwater Basin specifically have such highly productive wetlands is because they do dry. They're extremely dynamic. When they do dry, the natural grass that's here, the organic matter, breaks down and actually releases the nutrients and provides a fertilizing effect. This is typically our seasonally flooded type wetland. It's got primarily smartweed. It's a high seed producer. These tubers are highly nutritious for geese. All of these roots and the seed plant materials that are here are available to both the ducks and the geese. And so from the standpoint of food, it's a food factory for them.
Today, the wetlands of south central Nebraska are easily overlooked. The shallow basins are hidden away in the endless miles of grain fields. The same geologic forces which blessed this region with rich soils for crops also created thousands of small wetlands.
I am convinced that the rain basins existed here as long as 25,000 years ago. I can sit up here on this ridge overlooking this basin and look out and see Pleistocene mammals, the mastodon and other Pleistocene mammals grazing out in an area like this. I think it's probably been a habitat for birds for most of that 25,000 year period.
As the last glaciers retreated north, fine wind-blown silt was deposited in thick beds over the plains of Nebraska. Gradually, the nearly flat landscape was colonized by prairie grasses. During periods of drought, or where the surface of the land was disturbed, wind scoured out shallow depressions. Over thousands of years, fine clay particles washed into these depressions, sealing the bottoms so effectively they began to hold water. In time, water-loving plants colonized the shallow wetlands, attracting water birds in vast numbers and variety.
There's a few places like this in South Dakota, a few places like this in Texas, a few places like this in Australia, but there are just a few places like this in the world.
When wetlands in the Rainwater Basin were abundant, larger, and surrounded with native grassland, they were more than just an important stopover for water birds during migration. Many birds remained to nest and rear their young.
Wetlands, rivers, lakes, reservoirs, marshes cover less than 1% of the surface area of Nebraska. But they represent about 20% of our breeding birds. In other words, over 20% of Nebraska's breeding bird species, and there are about 200 species, are associated with wetlands.
When 100% of the wetlands were in this area, this was a fairly important waterfowl production area. The extent of wetland drainage has been so vast that it's probably not a major production area anymore.
During the drought years of the 1930s, dramatically declining numbers of ducks and geese drew attention to our vanishing wetlands. Preserving nesting areas seemed like the obvious solution. Conservationists concentrated on protecting the wetlands in the heart of the continent's waterfowl nesting grounds. Decades later, it became evident that protecting the nesting grounds alone would not be enough. Wetlands where water birds winter were equally important.
"30 years ago, this particular marsh was under a real state of threat. The drainage interest in this part of the country had proposed to dig a 400-foot wide drainage ditch through this marsh. So we came in and developed a system of levees in order to protect this land perpetuated as marsh forever.
In recent decades, waterfowl biologists have come to realize the importance of preserving wetlands along migration routes between wintering areas and nesting grounds.
Well, there's a formula for the survival of birds. You have to have a strong, productive breeding area to produce birds. You have to have a strong, productive winter area for the birds to survive the rigors of winter. And then you have to have that key area in the Midwest where the birds stop over in the spring. Well, of course, these birds spend the winter here from October into January and February, and then they pull out and they push north. And one of the major stopover areas for Gulf Coast wintering birds is the Rainwater Basin in Nebraska. It's an oasis in the desert.
Late in January, these snow geese and millions of other water birds will begin leaving the Gulf Coast. The conditions they find in Nebraska's Rainwater Basin 1,000 miles to the north will be critical to their survival.
If the rainwater basin continues to deteriorate, then these birds are really going to be in harm's way. There's no doubt about that.
The food that they pick up here dictates how successful they are on the breeding grounds. Research has shown that these highly productive rainwater basin wetlands can put as much as a pound of body weight onto some of our geese. And when you've got a 4-pound bird to start with, you're talking about 20 to 25% of their body weight is gained here.
During drought periods, many of the basins are dry. Even during years with average rainfall, there may not be enough basins with water. So most years, as waterfowl begin arriving, a few of the government-owned wetlands are filled with water from underground wells.
They need the water to spend the night on, and they come back and roost on the water during the day when they're not feeding. But the combination of food during the day and these relatively safe areas to roost on at night is really the heart of the ecology of the rainwater basin. The snow geese traditionally fed mostly on rootstocks of things like cattails and other shoreline plants. Their bill is serrated and adapted for digging in the mud and tearing out the roots. Canada geese and white fronts are much more grain and grass feeders, and they probably did a lot more grazing on dry land. But all of those species have now discovered corn as a good thing to eat, so they've all become, to a large extent, grain field feeders.
While many species of ducks and geese have adapted to a grain diet, marshes are still needed for roosting, and even the grain feeders cannot find all the essential nutrients they need in grain alone. The crowding of more birds into fewer wetlands has had a dramatic effect on all waterfowl populations.
It has certainly changed the species diversity. It's hard to know whether it has reduced the numbers of birds using the area. In fact, I don't think it has. I think it simply compressed them into fewer available spaces.
Waterbirds once had a broad migration corridor through the center of North America. As more wetlands were drained, this corridor has become increasingly narrow. Today, many of the migrating waterbirds are crowded into the last of the rainwater basins.
In '75, our peak snow goose count during spring was 15,000 snow geese. Last year, it was 486,000 snow geese, one point in time, one day. They can't find the spring staging habitat they need in Iowa or the Missouri River or eastern Nebraska, and they're coming here.
Most years, early migrating birds have moved on before later arrivals reach the rain basin wetlands. There is a constant turnover as birds arrive, feed, and move north. But some years, late winter storms force the birds to stay longer than normal. As more and more waterbirds crowd into the rainwater basins, the conditions are set for disaster.
Our worst year was 1980, when we actually picked up close to 32,000 ducks and geese. Mallards were the hardest hit, and pintails and white-fronted geese were close behind.
For over a decade, U.S. Fish and Wildlife disease expert Ron Windingstad has been called to the rainwater basin each spring to diagnose waterfowl die-offs.
There are obvious lesions here that are very suggestive of avian cholera. But if you look at the liver, you can see the different white spots that are studded throughout the liver, the tissue itself, and the liver is dying and it's showing up as those white spots. Right down, the final diagnosis is avian cholera.
Before the 1950s, outbreaks of avian cholera were uncommon in wild populations of ducks and geese. But since 1975, avian cholera has been an annual occurrence in the Rainwater Basin during spring migration.
It hits them real fast. It's been known to take them within 2 hours sometimes. And within a very short period of time, they die.
Avian cholera is a highly contagious disease transmitted by a waterborne bacteria. It strikes indiscriminately, taking healthy birds as well as the old and the weak. In the wild, all that can be done to slow its spread is to remove dead and dying birds from the overcrowded basins.
The birds that we're losing are the birds that are heading to the breeding ground. Those birds have survived the entire year, and in just a few short weeks they'll be nesting. And so we're actually reducing the nesting population. The birds are a symptom of a sick environment. Every time that I pick up a bird, I just feel we've failed somewhere. Not just as a Fish and Wildlife Service, but as a people here on the land.
Those birds that escape avian cholera face the next challenge of the perilous spring migration, a flight of hundreds or even thousands of miles to their nesting grounds. For many snow geese and the scientists who study them, this is home for the summer. This is the subarctic tundra region on the shores of Hudson Bay in Canada. For uncounted centuries, water birds have come here to nest and raise their young.
Snow geese, like most migratory waterfowl, have to carry all their nutrients with them to produce their eggs because there's just nothing growing when they first arrive. The birds really have to put on about 20% body weight before they can make the flight north and before they can possibly come up here and lay their eggs.
A 20-year study of this nesting colony has documented the effect of declining migration habitat.
What we're detecting is a real decrease in production. They're laying fewer eggs. They're smaller birds now. They're not growing as well. And although it's probably food that's largely responsible, we've got to bear in mind the possibility that pesticides could be picked up, and we're monitoring that quite carefully.
I think that ultimately man could certainly destroy the snow goose population. They could certainly drive it down by just continuing to eliminate places for them to feed. It's a balance we've got to hit, and I think that areas like the Rainwater Basin are critical for the health of these populations.
Within a few weeks, these goslings will grow flight feathers. As cold weather returns to the North Country, they will begin their first migration. As they and other waterfowl fly south, they will face yet another obstacle to survival.
Get ready. Take them.
While hunting reduces the total number of waterfowl, it is carefully regulated. And for over half a century, through duck stamps, fees, and contributions, hunters have led the way in preserving wetlands.
Everybody says the sportsman kills all the game. If it hadn't been for him, we wouldn't have anything left now. And now it's getting to a point where the people of the United States don't want to save this part of the country's heritage. Once it's gone, it's going to be gone forever.
Like when we first went for pumping in these wetlands, why, you'd have thought we were taking the very last glass of water away from that landowner's kid to drink, the way he fought. And actually what we ended up needing was such a minor amount of water compared to what an ordinary cornfield uses for irrigation.
I'm sure the tension's eased up, but probably the principal reason the tension's eased up is they've very seldom pumped those wells.
During the early 1980s, there was local opposition to pumping, Rob Ron emerged as a spokesman for area farmers who opposed it.
Our feeling is that the water is best saved for domestic purposes and for irrigation to promote the agricultural economy, and it was a little difficult for the farmers here to understand the use of irrigation wells to irrigate waterfowl, so to speak. And through legal proceedings and otherwise, well, we've resolved our differences over the project, and things are moving along quite well now.
We don't have to recognize a value, an ecologic or a wildlife value to wetlands. We can just apply solid, plain economics. It doesn't make economic sense to be going out with 60 to 75% public cost sharing to drain these areas when we're spending millions and millions of dollars to try to take land out of production because of commodity surpluses. It doesn't make economic sense for the American taxpayer.
Larry Swanson's 1986 study analyzed the role of government farm programs in wetland drainage.
My study just simply was to see if that was the case, if the programs were the deciding factor in wetland loss in this basin, and the program measures are the deciding factor in wetland loss in the rainwater basin. You know, it seems like we got to push things to the brink before we can generate enough attention to recognize what we need to do. The tax laws have been modified, the federal farm program's been adjusted, the swamp buster provision's been added, but it remains to be seen whether or not the agencies and the individuals who administer those programs are really up to it yet.
We have a president now that talks about wetlands as being critically important. And now we have to kind of shift gears and start putting that message out into the field and try and protect what we've got left and then maybe restore some too.
You can still drain, that's still the landowner's right. But if he does and adds to these crop surpluses, then he disqualifies himself for all the other subsidies that he would get. And so it's the landowner's choice now.
We each have to do what we think is best, I guess. To me, it seems like preserving what wildlife we have left is something that we'd better be doing if we're ever going to, or we won't have anything left to preserve.
If people become aware of the true value of wetlands and the benefits that everybody gets from wetlands, then we can begin to save what's left and to actually replace many of the ones that have been drained and destroyed. If that's really done, then those wetlands would be in good shape. Those wetlands will stand on their own.